Chapter 54, Future Talk. The house with the big windows had a way of making time feel irrelevant. In Manhattan, time was a resource to be spent, a ticking clock that measured your relevance against the rest of the world. But here, with the sun low on the horizon and the tide slowly reclaiming the shoreline, time felt like a circle. I was sitting at the reclaimed oak table, the one that had seen the Vanguard surrender and our first breakfast as a married couple. I was surrounded by architectural sketches for the new Sterling Research Center. It wasn't going to be a skyscraper of glass and steel. It was going to be a campus of light and wood integrated into the dunes further down the coast. Alexander was in the kitchen. I could hear the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of a knife against a cutting board. He was making dinner, something with garlic and lemon if my nose was right. The man who used to have a private chef on 24-hour standby was now obsessed with the chemistry of a perfect reduction. I set my pen down and rubbed my eyes. The claim was complete, but the future was a vast, unmapped territory. "You're scowling at the blueprints," Alexander said. I hadn't heard him approach. He was standing beside the table, wearing a pair of faded black jeans and a white t-shirt. He held 2 glasses of a crisp, chilled white wine. He set one down in front of me and leaned over to look at the drawings. "I'm not scowling," I said, taking a sip of the wine. "I'm calculating the flow of the neuroimaging labs. If we want the scientists to collaborate, we need open spaces, but the mapping requires absolute silence. You're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist yet, Maya." Alexander pulled out the chair next to me and sat down. He didn't look at the blueprints. He looked at me. "The foundation is funded. The UN is happy. The world is healing. Why are you already looking for the next fire to put out?" "Because for 24 years, my life was a series of fires," I admitted, turning my chair to face him. "If I'm not fighting for something, I feel like I'm drifting." Alexander reached out and took my hand. His skin was warm, his grip firm. "We aren't drifting, we're anchoring. But that means we have to talk about things that don't involve architecture or algorithms." I felt a flutter of nervous energy in my chest. Like what? "Like us, like where we are in 5 years, 10. He leaned closer, his gray eyes searching mine. "We've spent every second since we met reacting to the locked-in contract or the fallout. But the room is quiet now, Maya. What do you want to fill it with?" The question was the most intimate thing he had ever asked me. It was the ultimate future talk. Alexander POV. I watched the flicker of uncertainty in Maya's eyes. I knew that look. It was the same one I felt every morning when I woke up and didn't have a board meeting to dominate. We were 2 predators who had forgotten how to live without a hunt. But as I looked at the gold band on my finger, I realized that I didn't want to be a predator anymore. I wanted to be a builder. "I've been thinking about my father's letter," I said, my voice dropping to a serious, low register. "About the part where he said he loved my mother enough to steal the world for her. He thought that by owning everything, he could protect us. He thought the name was a shield." "It was a cage, Alexander. We already established that." "I know, and I don't want that for us, but it makes me think about what we do leave behind." I took a long breath, the salt air filling my lungs. "I don't want a dynasty, Maya. I don't care if the Blackwood name dies with me, but I do want a family. I want a house that sounds like more than just the ocean." Maya went deathly still. Her hand in mine gave a small, involuntary jerk. "You're talking about children." "I'm talking about a future that isn't a corporate milestone." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark Atlantic. For 15 years, the only thing I cared about was securing assets. But looking at you, seeing the way you handled my mother, the way you saved your father, I realized that the only asset worth having is the next generation of that fire. I turned back to her. I'm not asking for a decision today. I'm just telling you what I see when I look at the big windows in this house. I see a life that belongs to us, not to the company. Maya POV. The weight of his words felt heavier than any contract I had ever signed. Children, a family, a future that wasn't defined by the Sterling legacy or the Blackwood blood. I stood up and walked over to him, wrapping my arms around his waist from behind. I pressed my face against the soft cotton of his shirt, listening to the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. "I'm scared, Alexander," I whispered. "Of what?" "Of the blood, your mother, my father. They were brilliant, but they were monsters in their own way. They used people like variables. What if that's what we are? What if we don't know how to be anything else?" Alexander turned in my arms, his hands coming up to cup my face. His thumbs traced the line of my cheekbones with a tenderness that still felt like a miracle. "We've already proven we're different, Maya. We broke the cycle. We gave the science away. We stood in the rain and chose each other over the empire." He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. "The Blackwood pattern ended the day you walked into that ballroom and refused to blink. We're not them. We're the ones who survived them." "I want that," I breathed, the tears finally starting to fall. "I want a house that sounds like more than just the ocean. I want to see what you look like when you're not a technical advisor, but a father." Alexander smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes and stayed there. "I'll be a terrible father, Maya. I'll probably try to negotiate my way out of diaper changes and set up a security perimeter around the nursery." I laughed, a shaky, happy sound. "And I'll be the one who teaches them how to find the back doors in your security system." "It's a deal," he whispered, his mouth finding mine. The kiss was different than any we had shared. It wasn't about desire or victory. It was about the future talk. It was a promise of a life that was finally, truly, ours to write. Alexander POV. The intimacy that followed was a slow, deliberate celebration of that promise. We moved to the bedroom, the moonlight casting long, silver shadows across the sheets. There was no urgency tonight, no fallout waiting at the door, no enemy in the shadows. I touched Maya with a reverence that felt like a prayer. I wanted to memorize the way she looked in this light, not as the CEO and not as the scientist, but as my wife. I kissed the hollow of her throat, the swell of her breasts, the curve of her hip. Every touch was an acknowledgement of the future we were building. When I finally moved inside her, I felt a surge of emotion so intense it was almost a physical pain. It was a merging of souls, a crossing of the final line where I and you became us. In the dark of the Hamptons night, surrounded by the silence of our new home, we finally laid the foundation. "I love you," I gasped as we reached the peak together. "I love you too, Alexander," she whispered, her fingers digging into my back. As we lay in the quiet afterward, the only sound the rhythmic thrum of our breathing, I realized that the room was finally full. Not with money, not with power, but with the possibility of everything that came next. The future talk was over. The future was starting. Maya POV, 3 a.m. I woke up to the sound of the rain. Alexander was asleep beside me, his arm draped across my waist in that familiar, protective grip. I stayed perfectly still, watching the shadows on the ceiling. I felt a sense of peace that was so deep it almost felt like a new sensation. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't calculating the risk of his love. I was just here. I looked at the gold band on my finger. Tomorrow, we would go back to the city. I would lead the foundation, and Alexander would provide the consultation. We would face the press, the board, and the global challenges of the sterling revolution. But we would do it from a place of strength. We would do it knowing that at the end of the day, we had a house with big windows and a future that belonged only to us. I reached out and touched Alexander's hand, my fingers curling around his. The locked-in era was a memory. The fallout was a foundation. The claim was our reality. And as the first light of dawn began to touch the dunes, I realized the final truth of our journey. We didn't need to own the room, because we were the room. Alexander POV morning. I woke up to the smell of garlic and lemon. Maya was in the kitchen. She was wearing one of my shirts, her hair in a messy ponytail, her eyes focused on a pan of sizzling vegetables. She looked like the most powerful woman in the world, precisely because she was doing something so normal. "You're awake," she said, looking back at me with a grin. "I smelled the reduction," I said, walking over to her. I wrapped my arms around her from behind and buried my face in her neck. "What are we doing today, CEO Sterling?" Maya turned in my arms, her hazel eyes dancing with a lethal, beautiful joy. "Today," she said, "we're going to the Hamptons site. I want to see the spot where the new nursery is going." I laughed, a real, rich sound that echoed through the house. I think the consultant can manage that, as long as he gets a say in the security system. "No security systems, Alexander," she whispered, pulling me into a kiss. "Only windows." We walked out of the house, hand in hand. The locked-in era was a memory. The future talk was our reality, and as we stepped out onto the beach, the world was ours to build, together. Maya POV. The walk along the shore was quiet. We didn't talk about the science. We didn't talk about the past. We talked about the names. We talked about the schools. We talked about the fact that we were finally, truly free. I looked at Alexander and I saw the man I loved, the man who had surrendered his empire to find his soul. "Alexander," I whispered. "Yes, Maya." "I'm ready." "For what?" "For the future." He smiled, a slow, proud smile that was meant only for me. "Me too, Maya, me too." The sun rose over the Atlantic, a brilliant, unshielded gold. The claim was ours. Act IV was almost finished. And as we stood on the edge of our new world, I realized that the story of the billionaire and the scientist was no longer a romance. It was a legacy. And we were the ones who were going to make sure it never went out. Alexander POV, end of chapter 54. I watched the sunset from the deck of our new house. Maya was inside, her laughter echoing through the big windows. The world was quiet. The board was silent. The enemies were at bay. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the Vigil of Justice notebook. I opened it to the very last page. Under my entry, her power, the light that ended the dark, and Maya's entry, the final deal, to never look back, I wrote one final line for the future. The future talk, ours. I looked at the house, at the woman, and at the horizon. I was Alexander Blackwood. I had lost an empire, a name, and a reputation, and I had never been more successful in my life. Next chapter, chapter 55, Fear of Loss.